Hey everyone, this is Dr. Leila Galban, and in today's video, we're gonna be talking about applied linguistics and first language acquisition. Here we go. First, let me talk about the overview of this talk or this video. I will discuss the following topics. Number one, definitions of applied linguistics. Number two, first language acquisition. Number three, definition of terms in the field of first. Number three, theories of first language acquisition. And number four, a case study reviewed. Okay. Yes. First, applied linguistics. We have a lot of definitions for this term, and it's difficult to find an agreed upon definition. However, we can say that there are two main definitions for the term: a narrow definition and wide definition. A very narrow definition of applied linguistics has to do with that it is the research into or application of language learning or teaching. So the narrow definition of applied linguistics confines it to the field of language acquisition, language learning, and language teaching, testing, and so on. A wider definition, number two, refers to any form of linguistics that isn't explicitly theoretical. So we can find that linguistics is related to applied linguistics in general in interdisciplinary fields such as sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, lexicology, lexicography, forensic linguistics, translation studies, interpretation, and so many fields. So when we talk about applied linguistics, let's bear in mind these two dimensions, the narrow and the wide definitions. Okay. Here is a quick review of the definition of terms that are very common in the field of first language acquisition. Number one, the word acquisition itself. It refers to the unconscious or effortless form of developing the relevant skills required to use a language. So acquisition is effortless and unconscious learning of something. And the word learning, on the other hand, involves a sort of conscious and controlled process of achieving the same target. So when we learn something, this means that there is some sort of effort in doing this. It's not done unconsciously. And the apparent effortlessness of acquiring a first language has led some scholars, for example, Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, to put forward what is called a language acquisition device, or LAD, which claims that the ability to acquire a first language is innate in us. It's something that we are born with, and that language is an organ in our body, like any body organ, and it matures and it grows. And he considers that language is part of our biology, and it's part of our psychology. Okay. As far as first language acquisition, there has been a conflict or a war actually between two paradigms. The first one is nature, and the second is nurture. Okay, the first has to do with that we are born with the language faculty, and the second advocates the proposition that we learn language from communication with the community and with the environment and so on. And language is not something innate. It's something data driven and so on. And between these two poles, we find that there have been some intermediate paradigms which try to find a third way, combining the two dimensions, data driven on the one hand and universal grammar on the other hand. Okay, they are apparently irreconcilable. But sometimes we find that we can find some sort of common background, as has been attempted by some scholars. However, we can say that this dichotomy has been dominating the field up to the moment. Okay, let's start with, or let's go on and move on to language acquisition theories. And we start with the first one, which is behaviorism, and it's related to empiricism. And empiricism is a philosophy, and that says that knowledge comes only or primarily from sensory experience. Knowledge is what we experience, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, and so on. And it is one of several views of epistemology. Epistemology means knowledge. For example, we have other paradigms such as rationalism and skepticism. Empiricism emphasizes the role of empirical evidence in the formation of ideas rather than innate ideas or traditions. Okay, derived from empiricism, we find that this is behaviorism, and it's promoted by B.F. Skinner, and it was very, very trendy in the 20th and the 30th of the 20th century. And the idea that the behavioristic approach is predicated on the idea that language is learned through imitation and practice, along with positive reinforcement or encouragement from the environment. So, according to this theory, we find that children learn their mother tongue, but through imitation of sounds and imitation of the languages that is surrounding them. And the language acquisition is looked upon as a form of human behavior governed by laws of conditioning, and the child imitates the frequent forms of the language around him, and he receives or she receives some sort of encouragement or reinforcement. This was far from plausible, because the idea of reinforcement has received a lot of criticism. And Slobin, for example, said that the process of language learning continue without intervention on the part of the parents and care givers. We find that a child's language is not an imitation of his parents' language at all, and it's different, and it's maturing, and it has its own characteristics and its own laws. For example, we find that there are overgeneralization of the morphological markers. For example, the past tense, we find that children say go, good, and instead of go, went. So they have never heard the form good, but they made their own generalizations, which mean that they have their own mathematical calculations and formulas and algorithms. This is as far as the behaviorism is concerned. We find that behaviorism has received also a lot of criticism, considerable criticism by nativists, and particularly Chomsky. But let's first see what is cognitive revolution. Here we find that the cognitive revolution led by Noam Chomsky said that language is processed and acquired through some sort of pre-hardwired process that we are born with. And Chomsky said that this is what we called nativism. And Chomsky's hypothesis is that language is an innate ability, and the child is equipped at birth with a set of principles called universal grammar, and it is a biological or UG, and it's a biological development that the child goes through, and it only acquires a fair amount of communication with the environment in order to develop. Chomsky said that the child's language and the miraculous development of the child's language show that it cannot be attributed to what is hearing or what's receiving from the surrounding environment, because what's receiving is poor, too poor to provide such a miraculous production of language on the part of children, and they called what we that by something called poverty of the stimulus. And he rules out the idea that the child's language is an imitation of the caregiver's language or the parent's language, and so on. So language, according to nativism, is something biological. It's a biological process, and in this field we have a lot of ideas in the field. But let me tell you first what does Chomsky says about language and language faculty. He says that language faculty is a genetically determined initial state which can be considered a language acquisition device whose main function is to map presented data onto the steady state of knowledge attained. So this initial state is called universal grammar. So there is something called universal grammar, a set of principles that are there innate in us, and which later on change to compete or to interact with the surrounding environment, and we have what we call parameters. So principles are stable and parameters are different, and this leads to the creation of different languages later on. So we have only one language faculty inborn in all of us, and later on this state or initial state that we are born with develop into other languages due to the or various languages due to the variation in the parameters that each language imposes on the steady state or the initial steady state of the universal grammars that we are born with. Okay. Let me also say that let me give you an example of a parameter and a principle. There is a principle, universal grammar principle, which says that there must be a subject and a verb, for example. But parameters, we find that how the subject appears, whether it must be there in a sentence, or it could be understood from the context or from the inflection and morphology of the verb. This differs from one language to another. For example, in English, you can say she goes or John goes, but in Italian, which is called a verb or subject mine or dropping language, you can start with goes, and it's understood that the subject is he. The same applies to Arabic. For example, we say ذهب. The word ذهب is a verb, and it includes the subject is singular, masculine, and so on. So Arabic and Italian are two subject drop languages, because to recognize the subject you can look at the morphology of the verb, and the meaning will be computed. Okay, we have to say that the nativism or nativism trend or school or paradigm has a number of sub-paradigms. Let's have a look at them. three versions of nativism. Number one, maturation hypothesis. Number two, the continuity hypothesis. And number three, the modularity hypothesis. Let me talk about the first one, which is maturation hypothesis. This is proposed by Borer and Wechsler and Clashen, and they say that the innate principle of universal grammar mature over time in much the same way as a child's body grows and matures. So there is the developmental change in the linguistic system are due primarily to neurological maturation, which makes new linguistic competence available. So they say that universal grammar matures, and as a result of this maturation, language, the child language also matures and gets more complicated and becomes adult-like. Okay, and this is what we call the biological maturation. Such principles emerge successively in accordance with maturation schedule. There is a maturation schedule or order, and the child goes through this schedule, and this is why you find that a particular form appears, a particular grammatical form, for example, appears first, another form appears second, and so on. For example, in English speaking children, we find that the children acquire the get passive forms earlier than the verb to be passive forms. According to this theory, maturation theory, there is a biological maturation, and this and because language is a biological organ, and it's something that's genetically determined, we find that it also matures over time, and the child's language also matures over time. The second is continuity theory or hypothesis, and this is also proposed by Clashen, and they said that child grammar changes over time, and this is attributed to a lot of things. For example, the child's lexicon, the memory size, and the processing capacities. And he, Clashen said that child's grammar is structured once a new lexical item is learned. So child's grammar is restructured every time the child learns something. So it's a continuous process, and that some lexical and grammatical forms may be delayed until other forms are acquired, and until the UJ principles can become operative in order to help children acquire this. As for the third theory, which is called, or third version of nativism, which is called modularity hypothesis. This is advocated by Bates, Bresserton, and Schneider, and who say that language is modular, in the sense that each module is responsible for processing and representing a certain content domain. So we have a content domain or a module for syntax, a module for semantics, a module for phonology, a module for lexicon, and so on. And the innate language faculty, which is responsible for language acquisition, is believed to have a componential structure. Yani, it consists of modules. So our language faculty is modular. It consists of a number of modules. Each module is responsible for perceiving and learning a particular domain in the language. For example, phonology, syntax, lexicon, and so on. The modularity hypothesis is instituted by Fodor, and who maintained that language is a cognitive system distinct from other cognitive systems, and that all nativist explanations dwell on the innate of UG grammars. Okay. On the other hand, the non-nativist theories برضو عندنا في non-nativist theories. Okay. um, the let me first say this. We have a number of paradigms. For example, we have Piaget and Vygotsky as theories, um, which they say that we can say it's a cognitive and functional theories, which say that the pragmatics and the and the culture and all these things are very instrumental in the process of language acquisition. And there have been a number of philosophers and linguists who say that there must be some way between or midway between nativist paradigms and empiricist paradigms, and we find that, for example, Piaget said that children language progress through stages of cognitive development, through maturation, discovery, methods, and social transformations through assimilation and accommodation. Okay, so here we find that Piaget is striking a balance between nature, which is that we are born with language faculty, and nurture, which has to do with the role of the environment. And Vygotsky, on the other hand, his theory stresses the importance of culture and language on one's cognitive development, and he said that he proposes what we call the constructivist theory, which says that we construct our from the surrounding environment, our linguistic repertoire, and that culture and society are very instrumental in shaping our language. There are gonna be other theories I'm gonna show you, but let me talk about another important term here. This is called the critical period hypothesis, and according to this theory or this hypothesis, that there is a critical period, a period where the acquisition of first language we can acquire our first language effortlessly at a very young age. But if we grow up and we reach the onset of puberty, it's gonna be difficult for us to acquire language effortlessly. It's gonna be something difficult. And this is what we call the critical period hypothesis. They propose or the advocates of this theory say that the earlier the better. If we learn something early, this will be much better, because we're gonna learn or acquire easily and effortlessly. We have the case of Jenny, a young girl or a girl up to the age of 13 has been kept locked up in a room with very little exposure to any human language, and whose communicative ability later never developed beyond a relatively basic level. So though Jenny, a human being, is born with language faculty as innate, and the nativists say, but she was not able to develop her linguistic skills, because she was locked up in a room, and she was deprived from having interaction with the environment, which can feed into the development of her innate language faculty. So what we can say here is that there must be some sort of interaction between what we have, our innate faculty, and our environment. This is something that no one can deny. Okay. Here is acquisition order. We start with cooing, and from 2 to 6 months, oral and velar plosives and high vowels, babbling from 6 to 12, more individual phonemes, simple and CV syllables. We won't say that during babbling, human infants can pronounce all the sounds of all human languages, because this is the steady state, the initial steady state that has been mentioned by Chomsky. But later on, children start to pick only the sounds that they hear from the surrounding environment, and these sounds create phonetic and phonological categories in their brain, and children start to confine themselves to such patterns, and when they grow up in order and try to learn another language, they find this process difficult to acquire the sounds of the other language, because their phonetic categories of the first language become so fixed and so strong that they do not allow the intrusion of other phonetic, or the creation of other phonetic categories for the second language or the third language, and so on. This happens if we try to learn a second language later on in our life. So the earlier the better. If children can learn more than one language easily and acquire them effortlessly, as long as they make this earlier in life, in the very early years of their life. Okay. And then we have one word stage from 2 to 18 months. Single word serve as referring as phrases, often complicated, accompanied by overextension. For example, the word dog may refer to all animals, ball may refer to all round and shiny object. Then we have the two-word stage from 18 to 24 months, and generally we have subject plus verb plus subject, or subject plus location, subject plus adjective. So we find sophisticated syntactic combinations. And then we have telegraphic speech from 2 to 3 years. We have subject, verb, object, and so on. And now I want to move on to a study I conducted on the acquisition. This is just to show you briefly the study I conducted many years ago on the acquisition of tense and aspect in Egyptian Arabic, and I want to show you how things have been going. Okay, let's see. This is the title, The Acquisition of Tense and Aspect in Egyptian Arabic, and this is abstract. Okay, adopting a reconciliatory acquisition paradigm. Reconciliatory. We need to find a reconciliation between the two paradigms, conflicting paradigms, the nurture and the nature, the data-driven approach and the universal grammar approach, the empiricist approach paradigms versus the nativist paradigms. Okay, this is what I try to do in my research. Okay, based on arguments from competing ones. This cross-sectional study aims to, I want to explain to you the word cross-sectional here in order to trace the acquisition order of any linguistic form. For example, here in this case, the acquisition of tense and aspect. There are two ways. Number one, a case study to get a child and to trace the acquisition of, let's say, a tense and aspect in his early life span. And you check this every 2 weeks, for example, to see and record the changes. And this needs that you have a child, and this takes years to finish the job. There is an alternative method, which is cross-sectional study, and you can get, for example, a group of of children at the age of 2, and then a group of children at the age of 2.5, a group of children at the age of 3, a group of children at the age of 3.5, 3 and a fourth group at the age of 4, and so on and so forth. So you have a number of groups, and you can trace the acquisition of the forms that you linguistic forms that you are studying by by studying the language of these groups all at a time. This is called cross-sectional studies, to save time and to get the job done easily and without so much time. You don't have to need you don't have to wait for years in order to get the results obtained. Okay. Then we have yes, we want to track the acquisition order of tense and aspect Egyptian Arabic. This is one of the two aims of the study. And number B, we want to examine the relationship between lexical aspect and tense acquisition. Okay, here we have to differentiate between aspect and tense. And we know that tense is how to mark time, and the grammatical tool in marking time, and aspect also a grammatical tool, and both are intermingled in order to show whether the action has been done in the past, is being done now, will be done in the future, and whether also aspect here has to do with the perspective from which you can see the action, whether it's complete, so it's perfect, or whether it is incomplete, so it's progressive. Here, when nature occurring speech of 42 children ranging in age from 2 to 9, okay, has been analyzed due to the fusion of tense and aspect on EA. EA means Egyptian Arabic verbs. Results show that the three absolute tenses, here we find that there are absolute tenses where we can say that the time of speaking and the event time, there is some sort of absolute relationship. We find that the three absolute tenses, simple past اللي هي perfective, simple present or imperfective, simple future or imperfective. Perfective aspect. When I talk about perfective, I'm talking about perfective aspect, which means a perfect aspect. يعني perfect past and present perfect, imperfect, and so on. Present continuous type, simple present, simple future is also imperfective because it's not yet completed. And we find that these absolute tenses appear simultaneously at the age range from 2 to 2 and 6 months, with the past simple being the most unmarked tense, and this is relatively earlier than in many other languages. This has been surprising. We find that Egyptian learners or Egyptian children acquire tense and aspect earlier than their equivalents in many other world languages. And we want to see why the study is saying that, because of the fusion of tense and aspect in the morphological structure of the Egyptian Arabic verbal root. We find that the time to acquire tense is the same time to acquire aspect. We find also that we have another term here which is called aspect hypothesis, or which said that semantic features of the verb determines acquisition of tense markers. This is completely viable in EA due to peculiar morphological reasons. However, achievements, we have achievements verbs such as, for example, did, are generally marked for the best simple across groups, and activities verbs which refer to activities and accomplishments and states All these are called lexical aspects. The very structure of the verb denotes whether it is complete or incomplete. For example, when you say he fell, the word fell itself, this is, semantically, it is an accomplishment, verb, because the state has been, or the action has been done. Okay, so the findings here of this study are to some extent new because of the very structure of Egyptian Arabic, and how the topography of the language affects the acquisition of its grammar. Okay, we have an introduction, and we have also theoretical considerations. Okay, talking about the different nature and nurture paradigms, and or dichotomy, and then we talk about the behaviorist paradigm, and the stimulus and response, conditioning, and then we talked about maturation hypothesis, Chomsky, and the poverty of the stimulus due, which has to do with that the speech input is believed to be deficient or inadequate to warrant proper language acquisition, and this due to such factors as hesitations, incomplete sentences, speech errors, such which characterize child direct speech. And we have also Irvin Tripp, and the innate program. Also, let me go with you to talk about other. Yes, here we have Bickerton, who proposes something called language bio program hypothesis, which says that children have an inborn bio program similar to UG. This is proposed by Bickerton. So the idea of biogram, bio program, and then also we have Piaget developmental constructivist models, which assume that a common biological origin shared by languages, which interacts with the environment. So here he's striking a balance between universal grammar and the rule of the environment. Also, we have Roach, and who says that, Roche, who says that we learn the concepts or the events that are, salient in our environments. So the earlier salience of a given linguistic form in child language reflects its earlier acquisition. So if a particular form in the child language is salient, is so marked, is so unmarked, so prominent, and so on, children will acquire first, and so on. This is what she named e-prototype theory. Also, we have a lot of discussion on the constructivist theory, and then we started to talk about tense and aspect acquisition, and the theories that tackle this, and the idea of the aspect hypothesis, which says that, let me show you what's this. The aspect hypothesis that says that because of the features of achievement, the punctual italic verbs. They are acquired first, and then achievements, and then this followed by accomplishments, and then activities, and then states. You understand? So I hope that um, uh, we can give you this. I'm gonna send you this later on to have a look at it and to read and see how this study has been conducted, and what are the procedures, and what are the theoretical considerations underpinning them, and how what were its results, and how the results are discussed within the framework of the theories put forward at the beginning of the paper, and suggestions for further research. And that's all for today, and thank you. Goodbye.